Hey everybody, so this is a brand new show and it is called the Retro Hour Reflections. And what we're going to do on this is we're going to get previous guests that have been on the Retro Hour. We feel they've got some more fascinating information to talk about, or the Retro Hour, it's an hour-long show. We've got to squeeze all that information into there. So this is like an extended version where we have the extra aspect of video, so we can start to maybe look at some of the equipment they had in their childhood, look at some of the products they've produced, a kind of a show and tell, but also we're going to go into details of stuff that we haven't covered. So this week I have Randy Linden, and Randy is behind the fabulous Bleem, which was just an absolutely amazing piece of software. And he's also behind Dragon's Lair on the Amiga, the C64 emulator as well. So we're going to be talking about kind of how he got this stuff working on the Amiga 1000 and just a few extra tales, because we know you all love that episode, and that was episode 190. So you can go out and previously listen to that before you actually check that out. So how you doing, Randy? You okay?
I'm doing great, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate all of the very kind comments on my work. I've done a few well-known projects, and it's always great when I hear that people like the stuff that I've been doing.
Well, it's always been really amazing for me when I was a kid, because I saw Bleem and I was like, surely this isn't going to work. This is a kind of having an emulator on a system that was commercially available at the time, emulating another one. It was a kind of really weird concept. But let's go back to the start anyway. I remember you were saying in your interview that you were a Commodore kid.
Yes.
Yes. I was wondering if you had any of the kind of Commodore Kid gear.
I don't. Basically, what Commodore did, and it was a Christmas, and I must have been 12 or 13 at the time. They hired kids to go into department stores, and we were all dressed up. We had a blazer, and then there was the Commodore logo on the shirt pockets of the blazer. And we had Commodore 64s set up, and they had a demo. It was like a special Christmas demo showing off the graphics and the sound and the music capabilities of the Commodore 64. And the theory was it's so simple, even a kid could use it.
Yeah.
And so the blazer I don't have anymore, and it wouldn't fit. But I still have the Commodore 64 kicking around.
Well, the awesome thing is you kind of started out working with Syntax software, and that was kind of in your basement, right?
Yeah. At the time, I was 13. I was still going to high school, and Syntax actually published
so is this your first title then?
That's right. This is Bubbles. It's a Centipede style game. And it came on tape cassette, and it actually came on floppy disk as well.
Oh, wow.
And this was published when I was 13. I noticed that there was a company in the Commodore magazines that were available advertising a program called Cyclones. And it turns out that their address was like 2 or 3 blocks away from my high school. So one day after school, I walked over and said, "Hey, I've written this program. Are you interested in publishing it?" And they said yes. And that was sort of the start of it. They actually had 3 different programs. This is one of the printout sheets from the printing press. They had
wow. So they'd print those and then cut with a kind of a jig or something, and then produce the games. Yeah.
That's exactly it. They had 3 different programs.
Could you talk through the titles as well? Which are on those?
The first one is called Scribbler, and it was basically like a paint program.
Okay.
And then, of course, in the middle is Bubbles. And the very first program that Syntax ever released was called Cyclones. And that's sort of a, not so much Space Invaders, but sort of a take on Space Invaders, where you have to shoot down the aliens. But it was very, very early on in the Commodore 64 game days. This was long before, the massively classic hits from EA and from Activision. But yeah, that was my first experience on the Commodore 64.
Well, you also had you created a couple of titles, Data Storm and Vortex as well. Do you have copies of your old titles?
Actually, I wasn't the one who wrote those. Those were published through the company that I created called VDT, Visionary Design Technologies. Vortex was written by a guy named Andy Hook, and he brilliant software engineer. And Datastorm was written by Soren Grombeck, who you will know as the person who wrote Sword of Sodan on the Amiga.
Awesome game.
Yes, awesome game. So those were published through VDT, but at that point in time, the Amiga games market was sort of on the decline, and so the company didn't last very long. And then I ended up going and working at Bethesda Softworks, where I worked on a handful of Nintendo titles and Dragon's Lair, Escape from Singe's Castle.
Well, we'll go on to that in a bit, but first, you mentioned on the podcast that kind of you didn't really know what you were doing with the company. Like, there was a few things business-wise that you were a bit confused about, and
yes.
You famously made up some RMA numbers.
Yeah, when we sold, this was back when there were multiple steps between the developer and the actual customer who bought the program. You had to find a distributor, and then the distributor would sell it to a store, and there was all these middlemen that were involved. And an RMA number is a return merchandise authorization number. It was a system that big companies had set up so they could track all of the shipments coming in and going out, and we really had absolutely no tracking. And so somebody would call up for an RMA number, and I would just make up some letters and numbers, and they would say, so it was MPQ425-6, and I would say, yes, that's correct. And then we would get a package from whichever distributor it was with that listed as the RMA number. And for us, it didn't really matter. They just would send back, 6 copies of the game that somebody.
You kind of know where it came from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so we just replaced it and sent out new copies. But we weren't really tracking things very well. So that's a good example of a small company.
Well, what was Pocket Office, and how did that help kind of your later developments?
Pocket Office, and I've got that here. This is a brochure.
Okay.
From a company called Digital Solutions. Digital Solutions released a trio of programs initially just for the Commodore 64. It was a word processor, a database, and a spreadsheet.
Okay, like an office suite, kind of.
Exactly. It was an office suite, all made by one company, and it was the very first time that you had what we all are used to now, which is what you see is what you get. So the word processor, when you underlined a word, it underlined the word.
And that's pretty revolutionary, because I remember stuff like WordStar at the time.
Yes.
You would have to put commands in like B for bold, or you'd have to have certain colors over areas, and there wasn't that kind of WYSIWYG or that real-time representation on the screen.
Exactly. This did that. It did italics. It did bold. And the database similarly was sort of a design, your layout, create your forms. The spreadsheet did the exact same thing. And together, the 3 programs, this is the manual from the Pocket Filer 64-128, the first version. The name was changed. It was originally Paperback Office. There was Paperback Writer, Paperback Filer, and Paperback Planner. And apparently the company Digital Solutions received a nasty letter
from EMI or someone like that. Yeah.
From the record company saying you can't use the name Paperback Writer. And so they changed it all to Pocket. And so then we had a Pocket Filer and Pocket Filer 2 that worked on Commodore 64 and the Commodore 128. But it was the very first real Office suite that you could get it. And as I said, it was full featured. It had all 3 programs, and there was a spell checker and all sorts of neat stuff like that.
So how did that WYSIWYG kind of development help go into game development, and how did that help you later on with techniques and stuff?
I learned an awful lot actually from the guy who wrote the paperback and pocket writer. His name was David Foster. Brilliant programmer. He really was sort of a mentor to me, showing and educating me on a lot of techniques, a lot of programming style, sort of the right way of doing things, and a lot of the stuff that went into Paperback Writer went into Paperback Filer. There was a lot of code that could be shared. There were a number of ways in which we would implement something. And as it turns out, we actually developed all 3 programs on an old computer from Commodore that few people have ever heard of, called the B200.
Okay, I'm a big Commodore fan, and I've not heard of the B200. So.
Do a search, you'll find it was a big. It's about twice the dimensions of the C64. It was brown, but it had more memory on it. Okay. And the reason we needed the extra memory was because the size of the programs that we were assembling were getting so large that we couldn't develop them on the Commodore 64 anymore. So, and this was before the Commodore 128 was available. So we got the Commodore B200 and modified Commodore's macro assembler so that it ran on the B200 and gave us extra symbol memory because the programs stopped assembling.
So you kind of turned it into like a custom development unit then.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. We couldn't run the programs on them, the Pocket series on them, but we could actually run the development software, and then it would output the program that we would then run on the Commodore 64 or Commodore 128.
Well, that brings us nicely onto the C64, and of course the C64 emulator. I think you actually have a copy of it there. Oh, there you go. Yeah,
you got it.
The 64 emulator. Yeah,
64 emulator, along with the serial interface cable. On one end is Amiga parallel port, and on the other end is a standard Commodore 5-pin DIN serial.
And that would go into your 1541 then?
Exactly. Yeah. You put it into the 1541 or 1571 or 81, and you could then use your Commodore 64 discs. Something cool about the way in which the emulation of the disk stuff worked was Commodore disk drives were, and maybe many people don't know this, actually completely programmable. You could literally send down a block of code that was 6502 that ran on the actual disk drive itself. And this is the way that a lot of fast loaders and copy protection worked. You probably have heard of Vorpal.
Yeah.
I think that was Epix. And they released it as a plug-in cartridge. But then it sped up loading and saving and all sorts of disk activity. And the way it did it was by downloading into the 1541 drive custom code that then communicated with the Commodore 64 using a serial protocol, very carefully timed to the millisecond for on and off bits, and it sped things up. But it made it a colossal problem for the emulator, because the emulator wasn't running necessarily at full 100% Commodore 64 speed. So what we ended up doing was actually writing in native 68,000 the Commodore 64 side of a number of copy protections. So when the 64 emulator noticed that, hey, this particular game just sent down a block of code that looks like, Vorpal or one of the other fast loaders, we would basically self-modify the program that we were emulating so that it would then call the 68,000 copy protection communication logic that we wrote specifically for that set of titles. And then the game would just load, and it was all totally hidden from the user. They stuck a disk in, loaded their favorite game, and miraculously it just worked.
So if I get this, part of it was on the C64 on the 1541, and then part of it was on the Amiga, and
Yes.
it would pull whichever one it kind of needed for the protection.
Basically, yeah, there was a number of different copy protection routines that we wrote in 68,000 to emulate the timing very precisely, so that the 1541 drive, because it basically received, here's a block of 6502 code to execute to read different data off the tracks, that was still running at full speed. And so the emulator had to be able to keep up with it. And so the way in which we did it was by writing custom versions of copy protection for all the well-known large companies that were out there.
And I guess they kind of have to be in sync as well with timing. Yeah.
Exactly. So we weren't running for those, basically for those loaders, we weren't running an emulated version of the 6502 on the Amiga for the Commodore 64 side. We were running our own custom 68,000 code that was communicating over the interface using the protocol that Vorpal used or Epic's fast loader used, because on the 1541 drive, their original code was running at full speed. And so that's how we sort of worked around that and made the emulator much more compatible.
Well, I remember when I saw the launch of the Amiga. I wasn't there, but I saw a video of it in the past, and they had an emulator for the IBM PC in there on a floppy disk. But I was always wondering why they didn't do the C64 emulator themselves, as being probably the biggest selling computer in history at the time. It would have made a lot of sense for Commodore to do it.
It would. If I remember correctly, what you're thinking of was basically the IBM PC on a card. It was actually, I think they called it Sidecar.
Oh, on the 1000, yeah, the sidecar. Yeah.
And it was effectively a PC. But Commodore, I think, nowadays you could basically put the entire Commodore 64 onto one chip. Everything would fit on one tiny little chip, and to stick that into a new machine for backwards compatibility would be easy. But back then, Commodore was sort of a relatively small company. They didn't have a lot of software developers, and I think the expense of trying to shrink the Commodore 64 down to one or two chips to get hardware emulation wasn't really in the cards.
And I guess if it had been slower as well, it wouldn't have kind of really been worth it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Moving on with the Amiga as well, an absolutely amazing, stunning title you did was Dragon's Lair, and that was full motion video from Laserdisc, and you managed to get full screen animation, and full screen is a really important point because I used to play so many Amiga titles that would be in this like little stamp size on the window. So how did you manage to get that going, and how did you get the original Laserdiscs, and do you still have them as well?
Well, okay, good questions. Yes, I do have the original laser discs. They're in storage. They're about if you imagine a 33 and third RPM, regular like a vinyl album. Yes.
Yeah, I've got one here.
Okay, imagine that, except it's about twice as thick and it's metal.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, it's really, really heavy. That's what the Laserdisc looks like. And if you look really closely at it, you can see it's sort of divided into little tiny squares, where each of the squares is one of the video frames. I went to get the discs. Believe it or not, I went from arcade to arcade in downtown Toronto when I was working on it. Found arcades that had Dragon's Lair and asked them for the contact for the company which was supplying the machines. And then contacted them and actually got sent the discs. Fitting it onto 6 Amiga discs was quite a pain. We actually used, in order to digitize every single frame that was used, we got a helping hand from a company called Sunrise Industries. And the man's name who sent us the prototype hardware was Anthony Wood. You'll know his new company these days as Roku. Same guy.
Yeah.
Went on to do some more famous, super awesome hardware.
There's a great Amiga connection with Roku as well. I think they have lots of hidden glitches or like hidden demos inside. I think you can even get it to Guru or something like that.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. He basically sent us prototype hardware so that we could digitize a frame in two fields, technically a 30th of a second. It would digitize a frame. So on the Laserdisc, we would hit pause, take a screenshot of it, advance by one frame, and repeat over and over and over again.
How would you be digitizing it? Would you use DigiView, or would you be using like a Genlock, or what was the hardware?
Did. Yeah, that's exactly what this hardware did. It took an RGB composite input, and it then output RGB data files that we could then process. But because of the nature of the analog video signal, the non-animating portions of the screen, like the backgrounds, for example, that don't change, changed by 1 pixel here or 1 pixel there. So we had I want to call it a small fleet of artists who had to go through and touch up every single frame individually, so that where the background was stationary and not moving, between however many, it could be 10, it could be 20, it could be 100 frames, but the background had to be the exact same across all of those frames, so the compression could identify what was and what wasn't changing.
So with early digitizers, like you said, there's probably a margin of error, and you'd always get that. So you had to get guys to come and just clean it up, basically.
Exactly. Every single frame was hand-touched by an artist to clean things up, because even if you digitized the same frame twice, it's sort of like think of it as like JPEG artifacts, where there's a little bit of noise in the signal.
The color just becomes one, like a big
Exactly, and that's what we needed. We needed everywhere where it was solid green to be solid green without little flecks of brown or blue or or whatever the noise was. And so the artists have to go through and clean all that up. And then there's a separate tool that takes the whole sequence of frames and compresses all the frames into a video stream and an audio stream that then get put onto the discs in the compressed format.
Well, was it OCS as well? So it must have been like 16 colors, or
Yes?
yeah. So you must have had to reduce the palette quite a lot to get it to fit that.
Yes. We could use things like dithering as long as the areas that were dithered remained the same, so the compression would be okay. But there is actually a high-res mode where if you're running the game and I want to say it's H, if you push H, it shrinks the image down so that it runs in high res, and so that it shows you what it really could look like instead of being in lower res and filling the whole screen.
And you also had some pretty cool ways of getting it running on the Amiga 1000. So on other systems, it required 1 megabyte of RAM, but on the Amiga 1000, it was 512K.
Yes.
How did that happen?
What happens on the Amiga 1000 is when you turn it on, there's no kickstart. There's just a little tiny boot ROM, just enough for you to put in your kickstart disk, and it loads the kickstart into an area of RAM that's 256K big called the WCS, for Writable Control Store.
Okay.
And once kickstart has been loaded, it switches it from RAM into ROM, but it's a one-way bit flip. Once you change this bit in the hardware registers, you can't change it back into RAM. So what I did was figure out how the boot sequence of the boot ROM worked, and effectively what I do is I reboot the Amiga. I've set up the registers and the hardware in just such a way so that when it reboots the Amiga, that turns the writable control store back into RAM. And then before it has a chance to turn it into ROM, I've patched the boot ROM so that it jumps into my code. And so then I now have 768K, the 512 original RAM, plus the extra 256K of writable control store, which is now just regular RAM. So that's why the 1000 only needed 512K, but you needed at least a meg on any other machine.
That's amazing, because that's so specific, like for the 1000, because later machines had the RAM inside the EEPROM, but actually rewriting it and then telling it to find the ROM somewhere else in your code, and then is that how it worked then? Dragon's Lair would say to it, here's the ROM, and then here's...
That's effectively it. Basically, Dragon's Lair ran without kickstart.
Okay, so
on the
yeah,
1000.
just bypassed it, and then
it totally bypassed it. Basically, I reverse engineered their boot ROM, and this is all actually part of the source code, which I will be releasing. I'm working with the SPS, the Software Preservation Society, and I'm going to be releasing the code to Dragon's Lair, and one of the modules is how to magically turn the Amiga 1000 kickstart back into RAM again.
It's crazy, because even up to the point that we had the Amiga CD32, I remember there'd be some games that needed the extra RAM, so you'd have to warm restart the machine basically, and then it would boot into the thing, and that was probably telling it to ignore the kickstart initially, like based on that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't know any titles that do it the same way as I did it, but because Dragon's Lair, the whole program was only 8K.
That's so good.
Yeah,
I guess you had to get as much disk space as possible.
Yes, exactly. Which is actually that's a good segue into the other aspect of the compression and the copy protection. The short summary is each disk has custom format that fits more on the disk by slowing down the speed at which we write the data out to the drive itself. Early Commodore Amiga floppy drives had a potentiometer on the underside, and you could use a screwdriver and basically change the rotational speed of the drive. They got rid of it on later drives. So all the manufacturing, all the duplication was done at ReadySoft in the basement downstairs, and it was just a huge bank of Commodore Amiga drives stacked on top of each other, writing out copy after copy after copy. And all we did was tweak this little potentiometer so that we could fit more on a given track. When you read it on a regular drive, the reading mechanism has no problem synchronizing to the slightly smaller waveform. But if you were to try and write out that much data at the standard rotational speed, it was like 300, I think, RPM, it wouldn't fit because there was too much data. It had to actually be rotating at a slower speed in order to fit the extra data onto the disks.
And that's kind of like a very modern method as well. The way that they do copy protection of slowing down and doing wavy lines and stuff. I even remember with the Dreamcast stuff, they'd like slow it down and have a weird wave in the middle of it.
Yes, the Dreamcast used what they call constant angular. There's constant linear velocity and constant angular velocity. The basic difference is how big each pit and land are on the actual disk that was output. The Sega Gigadiscs, I'm just looking here.
Aha. Is that a blank GD-ROM then?
Bingo.
Lovely.
The blank GD-ROM, it's the same size, same capacity, but they, on the outer tracks, they basically do the same kind of thing where they're sending more data to the outer tracks than they are on the inner tracks because they're physically longer.
Okay.
So they adjust the rotational speed of the drive based on how close you are to the center of the disk so that you can fit more on the outer tracks than you can on the inner tracks. And mathematically, it all works out so that you basically get a gigabyte instead of 880 or whatever megs it is on a standard.
Awesome. Well, we'll stay on Amiga because we're nearly going to hit Bloom in a minute. But
Okay.
you did, I hope I say this right, Sinji's Castle or Sinja's
Castle?
Yeah. So you did the second kind of version of Dragon's Lair. And what were the improvements made on that one then?
There were a couple of them. Escape from Sinja's Castle was basically a lot of the missing scenes that couldn't fit onto the 6 discs because it was only 6 discs instead of like 12 discs. There were a number of scenes that were removed from the original Dragon's Lair. So Escape from Sinja's Castle had a bunch of these extra scenes that were missing. 2, it allowed you to install the game and the original version all onto a hard drive. So you could play the whole game from a hard drive instead of having to swap discs. And 3, I added support for split layered backgrounds. So there's one scene, for example, where you're swinging from rope to rope, it's burning ropes, and the background scrolls, and instead of that being a single image, it was actually 2 separate layers.
Okay.
So there was a couple of software improvements.
And then that kind of meant with the hard drive install, you could put the original one in and this one, and then play the whole kind of Dragon's Lair complete.
Exactly, and it allowed. I'm pretty sure that it also had the option to turn off the flipping, where in the original version you had to play the scenes. Um, and this is actually something neat about the compression. The compression, the video compression was done in vertical strips
Okay.
instead of horizontally. So effectively, when you play a scene, you either play it normal or you play it mirrored. And in order to play it mirrored, all that was required was decompressing the vertical strips from left to right or right to left. And the entire thing just flipped.
Ah, yeah,
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it was very fast and very easy to do. But so that's another little trick that was used in the compression so that it could play the scenes either way.
Well, you kind of left the Amiga as well, but you told me that you were invited to the Commodore CD32 preview. So would you tell us about that as well? Because I've got a huge CD32 collection, so I'm a big fan.
Yes, long before the CD32 was actually announced, um, this is still back when I was at Digital Solutions. So that would be the paperback office time frame. David Foster and I, and another guy, I think Don Holtz. Don was the guy who wrote the paperback and pocket planner, the spreadsheet side. Were invited to Commodore to get a preview of an unannounced new hardware machine. And that's all that we knew about it at the time. And then when we got there, they showed us the actual prototype of the CD32, and said, hey, basically it's an Amiga and it's got this and it's got that, but it's also got a built-in CD-ROM drive. So we actually got to see that many months before it was officially announced. It was nice to visit their headquarters. They were based out of Pennsylvania.
Ah, awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you moved on to the consoles, and you kind of got into the SNES and doing Doom on there. Must have been absolutely amazing. The virtual effects chip was really important, and that was developed by Argonaut Software with Jez Sands. Like, did you ever meet them? And
No.
I heard there wasn't much documentation or paperwork about it. So was it kind of a bit of a poking about and guessing game at the time?
It was. I've never met Jez. I've never met anybody from Argonaut. But yes, initially there was very little information. There was a Nintendo developer conference where they sort of say, here's, updated information on different projects and things like that. And it was a surprise announcement. And they showed Star Fox running. And it was still in a prototype stage, but they showed the actual Star Fox game running and received a standing ovation from all the developers that were there at the time, because it was unlike anything we'd ever seen. And we received a tiny little, it couldn't have been more than 20 pages, that basically described the high-level operation of the Super FX chip. A short summary is the Super NES is a character-based system. You can upload your character set. It's sort of like a font, and it doesn't really have a high res where you can plot individual pixels. What the Super FX does is, in addition to being a very fast coprocessor for things like addition, multiplication, you could even do high-speed division, it also has onboard hardware that converts from an XY coordinate to an address in memory that corresponds to a virtual font, more or less. So it allows you to say, okay, I want to draw a line and here's the X and Y coordinates, and start plotting individual pixels for the line. So when you combine all of the hardware capabilities of the Super FX, it sort of allows you to do custom full screen or mostly full screen bitmaps that are generated on the fly. Doom would not have been possible without the Super FX, both in terms of speed and in terms of the calculations to plot the individual pixels, because they still have to be characters for the Super NES to actually display it on the screen, and the Super FX did all that hard work for you.
So you kind of created this engine that used the power of the Super FX, but did you have to do stuff like massively reduce down textures? Or I remember some early clones of Doom running on the Amiga had like no walls, no floors, stuff like that.
Well, there were a bunch of trade-offs. Most of the levels are there. I think out of the console ports, the Super FX version had the highest number of levels. The levels themselves weren't modified. We did actually. There was a guy who was a real big Doom fan, and he made a number of modifications to the levels, and it basically says, no, we want it as close to the original as possible. Okay. So we have to revert all of that. But there are no floor textures. The engine could actually draw floor textures, but there wasn't sufficient ROM space because the maximum cartridge size was 16 megabits, which is a total of 2 megabytes. So the trade-off was the floors were solid colored or dithered, but monsters did not have all the rotations. So when you came across a monster, it was always effectively facing you. There were a couple of other trade-offs that had to be made, but on the whole, it was a fairly reasonable port.
Well, you named the engine the Reality Engine, and was that used on any other titles later on, or do you think it was too late in the SNES's life?
I think it was too late in the SNES's life to do much, but there was a couple of guys out there that reverse engineered Doom for the Super FX, and they made a Doom 2.
Awesome.
Yes, it was very, very cool. If they had actually written to me, I probably would have been happy to say, yes, here's how all the data.
Here's the original code. You don't need to reverse it. Yeah.
Exactly. Here's all the information. But they wrote a level editor that you could use, and made a whole bunch of levels. Yeah, it's very, very cool.
And you also had the super cool Rad Cards as well. How did you get them? And was it any extra money to have, the Super FX and a Rad Card?
Yes, and yes, and yes. It was actually Williams, the publisher, who got the red cartridges. There were two other colored cartridges. One was red and one was black, but Doom was the first one to use red. And out of just sort of a bit of trivia, the Doom cartridge was the most expensive cartridge that you could get from Nintendo, with one exception, and that is that it had no battery on it for battery backup. If we had put the battery on it, then it would have been the most expensive cartridge that you could possibly buy from Nintendo, but we didn't have a battery, and so it was the second most.
And it probably supported the most accessories for any Nintendo game as well.
It did. You could use the Nintendo mouse, you could use the Super Scope. But it was later on supported through the X-Band. You could use the X-Band modem with it and play one-on-one.
Were Nintendo happy about that? Because they must have like had only a few Super Scope titles, so to be able to add this onto the list, you know.
They were happy. I was just a big fan of having all those little badge icons that were on the box. I wanted as many as I could possibly get, and so that's why I put all of those things in there.
So you got all the badges, the Super FX, the red card, beautiful.
Exactly, sort of the pimped out version of
Yeah.
Doom on this Super NES side.
The ultimate release, yeah.
Exactly.
So let's talk about Bleem now, because Bleem is an absolutely fantastic piece of software, and I'll just get it down here.
Okay.
You very nicely sent me a copy here, and I don't dare open it. And this is it. And as you can see, you can play hundreds of games, PlayStation games, on your PC. Now, this was originally out for the PC, wasn't it?
It was. We first launched on the PC, and then one day, David Herpelsheimer, he's my brilliant Bleem partner. He did a tremendous job across the board. We had multiple conversations throughout the day, and he just one day said, "What do you think about putting this on the Sega Dreamcast?" And just sort of like out of the blue, just sort of a, "Hey, here's a cool idea. What do you think?" And so I did a little bit of investigation and dug into the specs and thought, sure, this is something that we can do. So David then contacted Sega, and we got a hold of, as I showed you, blank GD-ROM, and this is actually a Sega development disc.
So, because they sent you the Katana dev kit as well. So,
Yes.
Do you still have that? Or
Yes.
Oh, awesome stuff! Yeah.
Yes. They sent us Katana hardware, software information, and they sent us very low-level hardware register information. The reason they did that was because we couldn't use any of the Sega libraries or Sega software, so everything had to be written straight down to the bare metal on the Dreamcast. It was pretty much a complete rewrite of the entire program.
Well, do you have any kind of Bleem stuff there that you could show us and maybe talk through some of the versions and the packaging?
Let me see. Bleem stuff. Well, I do have some of the discs.
Oh, fantastic! Could you hold that a bit closer? Yeah.
Is that readable?
We can see the edges. Yeah.
Yeah. Custom. This is actually another interesting story.
So that's not an actual GD-ROM then?
No, it is a mill CD.
Okay.
That was the multimedia interactive something. I forget exactly what mill stood for, but I reverse engineered the Sega Dreamcast boot ROM and discovered that they've got a mode that can read regular CD-ROMs. Now, the trick was the code that contained the mill CD software in order to read the mill CD format does not exist in the Katana hardware. It only exists on retail Dreamcasts.
Ah, so they actually left it out of the yeah.
Bingo. So a developer who had a Katana could not look at the ROM and discover that there was this disk format that supported something other than GD-ROM. So what I did was make a little tiny program that basically copied the boot ROM from a retail Dreamcast and sent it over the serial port. And David built a little RS-232 converter that plugged into the back of the Dreamcast and into the serial port of the PC and used ZIP and Z modem. And basically I booted this disk and it transferred the ROM from a retail Dreamcast over to the PC, which I then reverse engineered and figured out how the mil CD format worked. And from then on, we could burn regular CD-ROMs that booted on a standard retail Dreamcast.
So essentially, you made a mil CD dev kit.
Yes.
Yeah, another
Yeah.
dev kit created. Well, I've got some other ones here as well, and I'm just thinking this was so it came out for the PC, and I guess this was the actual PC
Yep.
disc here, and then I love the packaging. I'd say that the great thing about the packaging is it's with this yellow, it kind of really stands out more than anything that you've seen on the shelves. Was that a real deliberate move?
Yes, that was David. David has as I said, he was brilliant when it came to advertising and marketing, but particularly all of the artwork, the logo, the advertisements, the packaging, all of that was done by David, and he very carefully chose exactly the color palette and the style and the theme so that it would stand out. If you sort of took a step back and looked at a huge shelf of PC software, it was hard to miss Bleem because it stood out so much.
So this PC version, was this much bother for Sony? Because it came out for the PC. Were they that bothered about it?
We thought that Sony was going to be really happy because it allowed, hundreds of millions of PC users to play PlayStation games, but Sony did not feel the same way. They were not happy with us. Let me say that. I'll put it that way. They were not happy.
Well, they'd had a previous law case with another piece of software, which was called Connectix Virtual Game Station.
Yes.
What did that do, and how did that court case set the way that Sony approached you later on?
As it turns out, Sony, the Connectix Virtual Game Station was first available on Mac.
Okay.
Before it was available on PC. And so Sony had sued Connectix so that by the time Bleem came out on the PC, they had already been involved in a lawsuit with Connectix for a while. But I think a couple of the differences are the way in which Bleem emulated PlayStation games compared to Connectix, and also the size of the company. Because Bleem was basically a 3 or 4 person operation, when Sony asked for the judge to halt sales, the judge said no. That basically Sony has to provide more evidence, more of a case before the judge was willing to grant an injunction. So we were allowed to release on the PC and ship while the lawsuit was still going on. And the second thing is how Bleem operates. Basically, I reverse engineered the PlayStation hardware by looking at the games themselves and how the games were communicating with the PlayStation hardware, whereas Connectix, to my understanding, was much more of a literal emulation of the PlayStation hardware.
Yeah.
So there's pros and cons to it. With Bleem, we could do things like enhance the graphics, use 3D graphics cards, things like that. Whereas with the Connectix Virtual Game Station, they couldn't really do that.
Well, because that was another thing, actually. If I just point out on the back here, you have from this to this, which is kind of showing the improvement that you can use by actually using your graphics card, which is really impressive, because we all know hardware acceleration is really hard to kind of get going, especially with emulators.
Yes, thanks. It was actually one of the key legal points that came up. One of the claims was made that we were infringing upon copyright by showing screenshots from various games, and the judge decided that it was in the best interest of the consumer to be able to see and compare the product. And so the judge ruled that it was legal for us to use those screenshots, even though we didn't own the game, as comparative advertising, effectively setting a standard so that you can see the difference and make a choice as to whether or not you want this style of graphics or these graphics.
So did that apply to all kind of Bleem products? So like the PC version and the Dreamcast one as well?
Yes, exactly. It's at a legal precedent now where if somebody's out there, my understanding is that they can do exactly that, where they show here's before and here's after, because it's better for consumers because they are better informed about the choices that they've got.
I wish we'd had that back in the days, because I remember getting a lot of games with amazing screenshots, and then you'd put it on and you'd be very disappointed.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
you also released it for the Dreamcast,
Yes.
which was a really amazing move to have it on a console, kind of with another console that was out at the time, and with approval from Sega as well. So, well, kind of approval, I guess.
Well, it wasn't officially approved by Sega,
Okay.
but they were very supportive. As I said, we received a lot of low-level hardware and technical documentation. There was one point at which at E3, Sega at their keynote mentioned Bleem, and we got a standing ovation from all the people that were in the crowd there listening to the keynote. But Sega could not officially endorse or support the product, which is why we went to the mill CD format, because with mill CD, Sega couldn't really prevent us from releasing, which sort of kept them in the clear as far as legalities go.
And I guess it's like maybe they were fans of it, or there were some kind of executives that would like it but wouldn't publicly go out and kind of
Yes.
do the hard sell or anything like that.
That's pretty much what it boiled down to. They very much were pleased that their competitors' games were running on their system and with the enhancements. Each of the 3 Bleemcast discs enhances the games specifically.
Well, that was another thing. So they were kind of released with custom versions. So you'd have a Gran Turismo release, a Tekken release, and was it a Metal Gear Solid? Or
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So was the idea originally that you would have one disc that would play all, or so how did it come down to these 3 releases then?
It was going to be 2 or 3 discs that would play a big block of games all together. The complexities of rewriting everything and making sure that it was fast enough and that it provided high quality gameplay pretty much reduced us down to one of 2 choices, which is support fewer games that are really enhanced and really max out the system, or support a larger number of games that wouldn't have the enhancements, that might not be the latest titles. So we picked 3 of the best known top high-end games from 3 different
and exclusives as well, ones that were just available for the PlayStation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. They were games that were very well known. They were signature titles, and we really pushed the enhancements in the emulation for each of the games individually.
And we know that the concept kind of worked anyway, because in the future, later on, there was a leak of the Bleem Beta, and then people also produced their own other games that were kind of bleamed, to then work on the Dreamcast. So if there was extra time, then you could have done more titles.
Yes, yeah. We had a long list of titles that we wanted to do. Crash Bandicoot series,
That would have been
Spyro the
good.
Dragon series. There was a whole bunch of titles. But in order to release it on Bleem for the Dreamcast or Bleemcast, literally everything from beginning to end had to work flawlessly. And so, as it turns out, there was a bug that is in the Sega hardware. Not so much the Sega hardware, but the Power VR hardware. And in Metal Gear Solid, when you were playing it on a particular level, the game would just freeze.
Yeah.
And it took a while to track it down. And it turns out that this hardware bug is a known issue. And the way Sega worked around it was in their software libraries, if they detect that the graphics hardware has frozen, they reset the graphics chip, and then the game continues playing. And so the end user never sees this because it all happens so quickly. But they knew that there was this hardware bug, and until I was able to track down, oh, there's a hardware bug, it's not a software emulation failure, Metal Gear Solid was sort of in this limbo state.
You can really see that with examples. So, like, these versions are really, really high quality. I've checked some of the Bleem stuff that came out later, and stuff like Tenchu Stealth Assassin, there's a lot of errors in there. So you can kind of tell that you'd have to go through, like, clean up the code, get it all kind of working, so it would be really enhanced.
Yes, a lot of the later games really started to push the PlayStation hardware. They were pushing it both in terms of code density, how much code they were running, and the tricks that they were using with the hardware. And so each of the three different Bleemcast discs does certain things differently. So if you were to use the Tekken 3 Bleemcast code to run Gran Turismo 2 or Metal Gear Solid, you wouldn't get the same results. The graphics would be as enhanced, and there would be various glitches and things like that.
And I guess like something like Final Fantasy VII would be a complete kind of different, a complete overhaul of the engine if you needed to run something that late on.
Final Fantasy VII, actually, the problem wasn't as much graphics as it was the length of the game.
Yeah.
Because the long RPGs, the extended adventure games, as I said, we sort of had to be able to play through the entire game to make sure that everything worked, because we're basically burning CDs here, and if it didn't work, we couldn't really have a 1.1 update for the disc. It sort of had to work flawlessly right out of the door.
And would you have to then also find more space on the disc? Because essentially you're running the emulator as well on top of the game. So, like, the original would be just Gran Turismo. Then you'd have Gran Turismo plus Bleem inside here. So would you need to do some compression or something to fit it all on the disc?
Well, no. What's on the Bleemcast disc is just the emulator.
Just the emulator. And then you put the data disc in.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I'd forgotten that you put the disc in afterwards.
You have to swap the disc.
It's been so long.
Well, also, you're probably thinking of the Bleemed titles that are out there where they sort of have combined it. But each of the Bleemcast discs also works with the NTSC, American, UK PAL, European, and Japanese versions. And some of them, there are 4, 5, 6 or more versions of Metal Gear Solid or Tekken 3, and so we had a library of all the different versions, and had to make sure that each of those all worked. There was
I never thought of that. All the different regions and all the locale and stuff like that. Whoa.
yes,
Yeah.
and there is one of them, and I forget which one it is, but one of the three games, when you boot it, depending on which disc you put in, and I want to say it was Gran Turismo 2, and it was the earlier pressings of it, but I could be wrong on that. There's a thing that shows up in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen that says, this game may exhibit graphics errors and something or other else, and it's because they ended up fixing the bugs in a subsequent pressing of that game. So that message only shows up if the disc you put in is that particular version of that particular game.
Well, also, you kind of. I did mention this on the podcast because I wasn't aware of it, but you were also developing hardware as well. So, could you talk about the Bleem Pod and the Bleem Pads?
Yep, another great idea from David. The Dreamcast controller wasn't as well suited to PlayStation games as the PlayStation controller. So the first thing David said is, what we really need is a way of using PlayStation controllers on the Dreamcast. So the Bleem Pod was designed by a company out of Hong Kong, and literally it plugged into your Dreamcast and allowed you to use a PlayStation DualShock controller to play the PlayStation game using Bleemcasts.
That's pretty awesome. So it's kind of just like a custom adapter.
Yeah, it's exactly what it was. And the Bleem Pad was effectively a stylized controller that had rumble and the dual thumbsticks, and it plugged into your Dreamcast like a regular Dreamcast controller, but it was more designed for PlayStation games. And we've got prototypes of those. There was a handful that were made, but by the time everything was ready and the cost of the manufacturing ended up that we just sort of shelved the products. There are a few out there. They do work, they do exist, but they're very rare.
So what eventually happened then? Did these titles end up getting pulled from the shelf, and are they available today?
They did end up getting pulled from the shelves. Bleem ceased operation years ago in an arrangement under non-disclosure with Sony. So we shut down, and you can't get any of the Bleem products. And you could probably go to a used game store somewhere, and they may still have it. But yeah, we have not had any Bleem related anything for probably 10 years now.
Well, keep your eye out, and you might find a random Bleem Pad somewhere out there. And I've really enjoyed talking to you about this, Randy. Is there anything you'd additionally like to add?
I want to say that, as I said, I'll get the Dragon's Lair source code eventually released. I want to thank Ian. He goes by Code Tapper, who helped me with Win UAE. I used the CryoFlux to get the discs into ADF Amiga format, but spent months trying to get it to boot Workbench and then Quarterback, which was the archive. These days, when you think of archive, you think of zip or something that's incredibly common. But the two discs, the two discs that I had that had the source code for Dragon's Lair were in Amiga format. So it required, like I said, the cryoflux to get the stuff off of those disks, and then I had to get it into WinUAE, and then from there I could use Quarterback, which then unarchived it to the RAM drive, and then from the RAM drive I was able to copy it to an emulated floppy drive, and then I mounted the PC hard drives on the Amiga under emulation, and then copied it to a directory. It was just like 14 crazy steps just to read the data off of the disks, but finally got it done.
Oh, that's excellent to hear, and I'm glad the Amiga community are helping you out as well.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. Well, we might do one of these again, Randy. It would be really good actually if we could do a Q&A.
Sure.
If you guys who are watching could submit some of your questions and answers in the comment section, and then maybe in a couple of months we can talk to Randy again and get your questions answered. So thank you so much, Randy, for coming on to Retro Hour Reflections.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.